All right, let's talk about the Korean War. It's this absolutely massive conflict that not only defined a huge part of the Cold War, but also literally sliced a nation in two, permanently. Okay, so think about this. Here we have a war with almost 5 million casualties. And yet, a lot of people call it the Forgotten War. How is that even possible? How does a conflict that devastating just slip through the cracks of history, especially when we talk so much about World War II or Vietnam? It's a huge question, and it's what we're going to dig into. First off, let's just let that number sink in. 5 million people. To put that in perspective, in the entire 20th century, only the two world wars were deadlier. And what's truly heartbreaking is that the overwhelming majority of these weren't soldiers, they were civilians. So, what we're about to get into is the story of this incredibly brutal war that, believe it or not, technically never ended. We're going to look at how it all kicked off, how it tore the peninsula apart, and how it all just froze into the tense standoff we still see today. Okay, so, a nation divided. To really get this war, you gotta go back, way back. You have to see how all the pieces were put on the board long before anyone actually fired a shot. So picture this. For 35 long, brutal years, Korea is under Japanese rule. Then, boom, World War II ends in 1945. Liberation, right? Well, not exactly. Instead of a unified free Korea, you get the US and the Soviet Union stepping in. They draw a line pretty much arbitrarily right across the map at the 38th parallel. And what starts as just a temporary line to manage the Japanese surrender, well, it quickly becomes a very real, very hard border. By 1948, you've got two completely different countries. And this is where it gets really clear. You've basically got two Koreas, each with a leader dead set on reuniting the country, but under their flag. In the north, you have Kim Il-sung. He's a communist, and he's got the Soviet Union and China in his corner. Then, down in the south, you have Syngman Rhee. He's fiercely capitalist, and he's got the United States and the UN on his side. So you have these two guys, each absolutely convinced that they are the rightful leader of the entire peninsula. Yeah, you can kind of see where this is going, right? It was a powder keg just waiting for a spark. All right, Section 2, the invasion. So by 1949, most of the American troops are gone. And from the North's perspective, this looks like a huge opportunity, a golden chance, really. And then it happened. June 25th, 1950. In the dark, early morning hours, the Cold War, which had been this sort of icy standoff, suddenly became blazing hot. 75,000. That's how many North Korean soldiers poured across the 38th parallel. I mean, let's be clear, this was no border skirmish. This was a massive, all-out invasion. And here's the kicker. They weren't just running across with rifles. They had tanks, about 150 Soviet-made T-34s. The South Korean army was completely unprepared for this. They had practically nothing that could stop an armored assault like that. It was a total game changer. And the results were, well, they were devastatingly fast. The capital city, Seoul, it fell in just 3 days. The North Korean army was like a steamroller, just pushing and pushing the defenders all the way down into this tiny little pocket in the corner of the peninsula, what became known as the Pusan Perimeter. It honestly looked like the entire war was going to be over in a matter of weeks. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This brings us to the next phase, the Seesaw War. Because what happened next was this insane series of wild, violent swings back and forth. So, the UN commander, this larger-than-life figure, General Douglas MacArthur, he comes up with a plan, and it is a huge gamble. He wants to do an amphibious landing, storms the beaches with boats and troops, but way, way behind enemy lines at a port called Inchon. Now, everyone thought he was crazy. The tides at Inchon are just nuts, some of the most extreme on the planet, and the channels are super narrow. It was basically seen as a suicide mission. But MacArthur's whole thing was, yeah, that's the point. He basically said that because it's so ridiculously difficult, no one will ever expect it. And guess what? He was absolutely right. The landing at Inchon was a spectacular success. It completely cut off the North Korean army, forcing them into this chaotic retreat. Seoul was taken back. The entire war was flipped on its head. Okay, so now the UN forces are on the offensive. They push north, back across the 38th parallel, and they just keep going, getting closer and closer to the Chinese border. MacArthur is feeling pretty good about himself, even tells the troops they'll be home by Christmas. But
Up in China, Mao Zedong is watching all this, and he starts sending these very clear warnings. Don't come any closer. And for the most part, those warnings were just ignored. And then, late in 1950, the other shoe dropped. Suddenly, around 300,000 Chinese soldiers, they were called volunteers, come flooding across the border. It was a complete shock, a massive counterattack that once again changed everything about this war in the blink of an eye. What followed was just pure hell on earth, especially at places like the Chosin Reservoir. We're talking about a brutal, brutal winter. It was so cold that weapons would literally freeze solid. Guys were getting frostbite before they could even pull a trigger. It was this nightmarish fighting that led to the longest retreat in American military history. And the war just got stuck in this bloody back and forth. I mean, the city of Seoul actually changed hands 4 different times during the war. Just think about that. So after all that, after all the back and forth, the brutal fighting, the war eventually just grinds to a stop. But the key thing here is it didn't really end. And this is maybe the most important thing to understand about the entire conflict. The document that was signed on July 27, 1953, it was not a peace treaty. It was an armistice. And all an armistice is a truce. It's an agreement to stop shooting at each other. It paused the fighting, sure, but it never, ever officially ended the war. And look at the price of that stalemate. Just look at these numbers. All that fighting, all that back and forth, and the front lines ended up almost exactly where they started. But the human cost was just staggering. Millions dead. And again, look at who paid the highest price. It was civilians, by a huge margin. So, with no peace treaty, what did they get? They got a new border, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. It's this 2.5-mile-wide no-man's land that cuts right across the peninsula. And today, it's the most heavily armed, most fortified border on the entire planet. It's like a permanent scar, a constant reminder that the war never truly finished. Okay, let's look at the result of all this. 2 Koreas today. The legacy of this frozen conflict is pretty incredible. It's like a real-world experiment of 2 nations starting from the same place with the same people and culture, but taking completely opposite paths. And the difference is just night and day. On one side, you have South Korea. It's become this thriving, high-tech democracy. You know, a global powerhouse. Think Samsung, think Hyundai. It's a huge player on the world stage. Then you have North Korea. It's still this isolated, deeply impoverished dictatorship passed down through 3 generations of the same family, basically sealed off from the rest of the planet. And that really brings us to the big question, the one that still hangs over everything today. After more than 70 years of this frozen conflict, can there ever be a final peace? It's a question that affects not just the Korean peninsula, but the entire world. Because at the end of the day, the 2 Koreas are technically still at war. Which means the forgotten war is, well, it's really the war that never ended.